Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is A Friday Reads. Will Wiles, The Way In. Caleb Azumah Nelson's Small Worlds, his new book, the follow-up to Open Water, which I haven't read. Claudia Rankine, Don't Let Me Be Lonely, an American lyric. Do we call this poetry, prose poem? I'm not sure, but I think because it's called an American lyric, I'm going to count this as poetry. George Perec, Portrait of a Man, translated by David Bellos, long-time collaborator with Perec. And finally some non-fiction, 69 Exhibition Road by Dorothy Max Pryor, a woman who's at the centre of the outbreak of punk in London in 1976-1977. So I'm going to start with Will Wiles. So I read his last book, which is his third, called Plume. And that had an alcoholic as the main character, and I really can't be doing with sort of addicts and alcoholics anymore. I have it in my own family history. I've read about it, I've written about it, and I just can't bring myself to read it anymore. I'm done. I'm sort of played out or maxed out on the subject, and yet I love that book because Will Wiles is an extraordinary writer about urban space. He writes novels, you know, this isn't psychogeography or anything, but both that book and this book are all about space. And I will leave a link in the show notes to my review of Plume. So this is about a man who works for a company that offers the service that if you pay them, they will attend boring all day or all weekend conferences so that you don't have to. Your company think that you're there, and you certainly go back and sort of give them the debrief because this guy's company will provide the debrief on the basis of this guy going. So he might be going to represent, you know, 3 or 4 different companies and clients at any one conference, and that's his job. And he does this pretty much every day. And the book opens where he's going to this conference in a new urban development, which exists, which is made up of a huge conference centre and the hotel in which he and all the other guests are staying, and a partially built skywalk, which is not complete. And there's lots of other sort of foundations and stuff for other hotels, but none of them are completed. And this is at a time of sort of economic crunch for the UK, and you know these other places might not get completed. So we have lots of, as I say, interesting sort of spatial descriptions. So you've got this whole sort of development of the area of the hotel and the conference centre. The conference centre that is huge, so huge you can't see its edges, you can't see its borders when you're inside, which is kind of the point. It's sort of a paean to capitalism's infinite largesse that you can never find the end of it. Whereas all the exhibitors are all in sort of honeycomb-like booths within it, have very defined, restricted spaces, and they have to maximise, you know, how they attract the eye of all the attendees, you know, draw them into their booth and not the one next door or whatever. And yet they all use similar things of tote bags and badges and stickers and all this kind of stuff. So that's the conference centre. We get a lot on the hotel, and I'm going to read a bit about that in a minute. And even though the hotel is very close to the conference centre, they're separated by a motorway. So they have to take a coach. Again, this sort of crazy sort of spatial, you know, it is literally, you could walk it if there wasn't a bloody great motorway in the way. So there's all this stuff about space and perception and surface. And I just want to read you this brilliant sort of deconstruction of sort of existence in hotels. This guy loves hotels. He very rarely sort of goes back to his own house. He'd much rather have this day-to-day peripatetic existence in hotels. The paintings are all over the hotel, in my room, here in the restaurant, out in the lobby, in the bar, and so it was in every Way Inn, which is the chain of hotels. They were all variations on an abstract theme, meshing coffee-coloured curves and bulging shapes, spheres within spheres, arcs, tangents, all inscrutable, suggestive of nothing. I'd never really examined them. They were not there for admiring. They were there simply to occupy space without distracting or upsetting. They were an approximation of what a painting might look like, a stand-in for actual art. They worked best if they decorated without being noticed. All they had to do was show that someone had thought about the walls so that you, the guest, didn't have to. An invitation not to be bothered. Now that she had drawn my attention to them, I could see that she was right. They were everywhere. How many in total? I felt uncomfortable even asking. So I just think that's a brilliant concept of art that is not art. So it has the sort of physical appearance of art because it's a painting or a print or whatever, but it actually functions as anti-art or non-art. And as an extension of that, he talks about the job he had before he landed this one, where he worked for a company that was sort of produced alternative materials to mimic more expensive materials. Ugly work, literally. I prefer not to reflect on it, and I focused hard on my particular minor role, which was to scour trade fairs for those cheaper materials. What could stand in for stone? What would do in place of copper? What was the bargain basement equivalent of hardwood? All my life I've been interested in what the world was truly made from. If not all my life, then at least from the very early age when, looking at the chipped edge of a table at home, a wood-grain veneer over a crumbling, splintery inner substance, I discovered that surfaces were often lies. So the first third half of this book is really just sort of exploration of all these different spaces and their surfaces and their shapes and whether they're limitless or whether they're very contained. And it's about capitalism. And then sort of part two goes into much more of a sort of almost supernatural thriller with the hotel at the heart of it. Now, normally I just sort of fling my hands up in despair, a bit like the alcoholic narrator of Plume. But again, it works here because it's quite clearly a symbol for capitalism eating itself, the all-consuming nature of capitalism. And it's only really the last third where all of that sort of interesting, both descriptive and symbolic stuff really sort of gets thrown over for plot resolution. It's a bit like House of Leaves in that sort of, you know, the sort of space keeps exponentially growing and developing. I can't say too much more because it would be a spoiler, but for the first two-thirds of this book I was utterly sucked in and entranced, and it did lose its way substantially in the last third, as I say, when it just became about plot resolution. So it was on course for a 5-star, but that last third really didn't engage me. So I give it 4.5. But this writer absolutely pushes my buttons in things that I'm really interested in, and he's a damn good writer on them as well. I would hope. I mean, this is his second book. Plume, I felt, was sort of more rounded book, and hopefully his next one will eschew this sort of tendency to sort of get bogged down in plot. 4.5 stars. And on to Caleb Azumah Nelson's Small World. This came out very recently. I actually have Open Water downstairs in the bookshelves because my wife had it for a book club, and I've never got round to reading it. I keep intending to, but I haven't got round to reading it. And when this came out, I thought, I'll get this and read it. Even though I had a free book by the same author I could have read. I didn't, anyway. And having read this, I have no desire to pick up Open Water. It's just not for me, even though I concede that it's a well-written, well-crafted, well-put-together book. It's a bit too mainstream for me. It's a bit too sentimental, really, I think, for me. So it's about, it has 3 parts, one in 2010, one 2011, and one 2012. And the Small Worlds, I think, refers to those sort of dog days of summer, where it's your last school holidays, you've graduated from school, and then from that small, protected, quite narrow vision world of childhood and adolescence, you're about to launch into the world of adulthood, which is much more threatening, much less protected. And he's waiting to go to university. He is quite inhibited. He's very sort of male in that way, not really able to express himself verbally and emotionally. But his chosen means of expression is dance and music. And music is, vitally throughout all of this. Interestingly, it's lots of different musics. It's not one particular genre. So he himself plays jazz trumpet, but he listens not only to jazz, he listens to hip hop. He listens to, he was brought up with gospel music in the church. So it's also, and dub reggae because of the part of London that he's in, even though he himself is not Jamaican, he's Ghanaian, or of Ghanaian extraction, I should say. So that is how he expresses himself. If he's in rhythm, and if the world is in rhythm, things are good. It's when he can't find the rhythm, when it's that's when things are all out of sorts. He's sweet on a girl, but he's so inhibited he can't really bring, sort of ask her out kind of thing. And in that sense, he was quite an annoying character in this sort of first part, I have to say. He goes to uni. His dad is encouraging him to do business studies when he wants to do music, but he didn't get into music school. His grades weren't good enough, whereas the girl he's sweet on, she made it to music school. So already they've sort of driven apart, having just got together. So he finds himself very isolated in university. And again, this sort of insularity, this introversion really does for him. Instead of sort of making a social life there, with a clean sheet, he doesn't. And he becomes depressed, really, and drops out. At which point his father is absolutely furious with him and basically kicks him out of the house. And this is a book ostensibly about fathers and sons, because his father, who was the immigrant who came over, who migrated, had lots of dreams. They were very frustrated, and there was even a point where he was drinking because of grief suffered, and he and his wife got in a blazing row, and he stormed out of the house, dragging the two boys with him in that sort of male thing. These are my sons. You'll never have my sons. And the boys sort of dig their heels in. And the father turns around to them and sort of says, I don't need you, and storms off. Now, the father does come back pretty quickly after that, but that has always stayed with the lead character here, which you can understand for a young child to basically be rejected by the father. But they can't talk about it. Neither of them can express themselves. So then we go into part 2, which is set against the backdrop of the 2011 riots, when an Afro-Caribbean man called Mark Duggan, who was a minor street drug dealer, was shot and killed in a police stop in his car. And that sparked a series of a week-long's worth of riots in London, which also extended a little outside, but they were very much copycat riots, an excuse for looting. In London, they were sort of heavily we're not going to take this anymore, sort of corrupt police, brutal police, a time I remember very well. And it's really the music on that is that in the same way as Mark Duggan was erased by this sort of police manoeuvre of 3 cars wedging him in and ultimately shooting him, that Nelson sort of muses on this sort of erasure of black men and black people within Britain. It's a bit tenuously written. I'm not saying that it's not a legitimate thing to make, but it's not front and central enough, I think, to ram that point home. I mean, you don't want to over-egg it, and make it too obvious and too ranty, and I get that, but I couldn't see the connection. And it was only by the very end, the last 40 pages, when this thing about fathers and sons and the riots is brought together. But by then, for me, it was too late. I'd had to wade through 200 very slow pages where not much happens really. And I didn't get on with the pace of the book. I think that was it. And yes, I thought, actually, he brings it together really well at the end, but it wasn't enough to salvage the book for me. And then I also sort of had problems with this whole notion of his inability to express himself. So I just want this moment to stretch, pull, hold, but the flash on his camera goes and I'm in an interruption. Something shifts. It's on Pop's face as he hands Malachi back to Ray and walks towards the house. He passes me but looks past me, as if I'd been disappeared from his mind. So again, this notion of erasure is not only an ethic, a cultural thing by the society that hosts them, but it's also within the family that the father has erased the son. I call after him, but there's no reply. He leaves me to carry the shame of a man who doesn't know how to say how he feels, or rather, doesn't know how to bridge the gap between feeling and expression, and fears trying. Fears what he might find out about himself. He leaves me standing there, holding the shame of a son whose father won't speak to him. So that applies to both of them. Neither of them can really express themselves and their feelings. And that's fine if that's the point. But then we get this, which I just found bizarre. Still of late, I felt the urge for more. I've always had a decent grasp on who I am, or where I might find myself, but I've never really known where I come from, and that presages a trip back to Ghana. No, but he hasn't. All throughout the book, he doesn't know who he is. He's, instead of sort of projecting a sense of who he is, his identity at university, he sinks back into insularity and depression. So that didn't make any sense to me. And there are one or two clumsily written things. So it is very well written, but every now and again you stop up and go, well, that's a bit clumsy, really. So all in all, I didn't really get on with this. 3 stars. And on to Claudia Rankine. You may know her book Citizen. This is again in a similar style, that it's sort of slightly multimedia. It's sort of prose poetry, if it's poetry at all. And it's a meditation on death. And a really interesting one, I think. It starts off with her saying that she doesn't ever remember being formally introduced to death by the death of grandparents as a young child, or the death of a pet. When characters die in a film, she asks, is he really dead? Is she really dead? She's referring to the actors, not the characters. And then she'll see that actor being interviewed on a talk show and she'll go, well, you told me he was dead. So there's a lot of sort of inquiry and confusion brought with her from childhood about the nature of death. We get, one of her best friends has cancer, terminal cancer. We also get the 9/11 bombings and a meditation on death and terrorism there. It's just so rich. It's just so rich. I love her work. Or one begins asking oneself the same question differently. Am I dead? So she's referring, this comes straight after the question about characters and actors on TV. Are they dead? No, it's not about them. It's, am I dead? Though this question at no time explicitly translates into, should I be dead? Eventually the suicide hotline is called. You are, as usual, watching television, the 8 o'clock movie, when a number flashes on the screen, 1-800-SUICIDE. You dial the number. Do you feel like killing yourself? The man on the other end of the receiver asks. You tell him, I feel like I am already dead. When he makes no response, you add, I am in death's position. He finally says, don't believe what you're thinking and feeling. Then he asks, where do you live? So I think that sets up the fundamental tension at the heart of it. Most people choose not to think about death. And even a suicide advisor on a hotline has very tramline thinking about what he needs to say in order to stop the other person killing themselves. She is coming from it from a whole unique angle that her subjectivity has formed as a child. That she wasn't exposed to death, but when she saw it on TV, she had a whole load of questions which weren't really properly answered to her mind. So then she says, well, am I dead? I just think I love Claudia Rankine's take on things. It's so different to sort of mass thinking. And finally, I'm just going to read this. A friend tells me this story. She goes to a bathhouse in Los Angeles and sees an old woman with an identification number on her arm. The markings begin with the letter A. I saw her concentration camp number, and then it started with the letter A. My cousin has the same one, so I said, my cousin was in the same concentration camp as you, Auschwitz. I was in Auschwitz, but how did you know? Because of the A. It turns out the A's collision with Auschwitz is pure coincidence. The A in the identification number stands for the German word for worker, Arbeiter. You think the A stands for location, but it stands for function. What my friend wanted to communicate to me about that conversation was that Frida Berger and I had defied history in order to have it. She was supposed to be dead, and I was supposed to never have been born. And we both lived and found each other in LA. And she was able to tell me this detail about the letter A, a detail that allowed me to begin to be true to her life as precisely as it is lived. So again, you know, a take on something, on a concentration camp tattoo, which is just so different to everybody else's. Fabulous stuff. 5 stars. And on to Georges Perec's Portrait of a Man, which is both his first and his last book. So it was published posthumously, as per his instructions, but it was actually a manuscript that he started writing at the start of his career, but couldn't get it right to his satisfaction and kept coming back to it. It's about an art counterfeiter who basically loses his mind, loses his shit, and shoots his patron, his criminal patron, and is sort of held in the basement where he's basically sort of been imprisoned to do all these counterfeit pictures. He's sort of locked in there, or he locks himself in, so that the guy's confrere can't sort of, you know, take vengeance on him, and he begins tunnelling out. And it's told in retrospection about how he got into it and the relationship with these criminal guys. Lots of meditations on the nature of because I've read several books about novels about counterfeiting, and they always present the fact that the counterfeiter really wants to be known as a painter in their own right. To paint, you know, the difference between counterfeiting a pre-existing painting and making one up in the style of a famous artist, that's always much more pleasing somehow to these counterfeiters, because it's a genuine new piece of work, unlike a copy. And I've read that in William Gaddis's, no, it's called The Recognition, sorry. And I've read it in other books. Perec's previous book to this, again published posthumously, it's called 3 by Perec, includes one of the 3 stories is about counterfeiting in art. I mean, Perec was obviously obsessed with the subject, and that's fine. But I feel between other texts that I've read on counterfeiting and that story in his previous book, this added very little for me. I found it a bit tedious, to be honest. And this is now my 8th Perec book. I don't feel I'm going to read any more. I mean, I started at such a high point with Life a User's Manual, W, A Memory of Childhood, which are brilliant books. And then gradually, as I've sort of tracked down more of his work, the bits around the edges, the marginal bits, they're not nearly as good, unfortunately. So I can't remember if I gave this 2. I think I gave it 3 stars, but actually it's probably closer to 2.5. And finally, some non-fiction. So Dorothy Max Pryor was 21 in 1976, living in a road that's called Exhibition Road, and she lived in number 69. Ho ho titty ye not. But in fact, one of the things she did go on to do was work as what we would now call an exotic dancer. In the 70s, pre-lap dancing, so it wasn't as sort of a full-on sexual contact with the clientele. It was much more a voyeuristic thing. But that's only part of this story, part of this book. She was there at the beginning of punk rock in London in 1976, 1977, and mixed with very key figures in the movement. And she's one of those characters herself who was not, a glutton for fame. She wasn't particularly career-minded in that, I'm going to be in a band, and, but she played a key role, partly facilitating networking as people met people in where she lived. She happened to be in a long-term relationship with a guitarist who was in Adam and the Ants, who were probably the biggest name band that she was in the circles of, but also Psychic TV, come Throbbing Gristle, very important in establishing the genre of industrial music. So she was one of those people like Patti Smith in New York, who was around key players in different movements, different genres, facilitating them very modestly, You know, she, as I say, she wasn't seeking repute and renown herself, but she just, through her ease and her modelling of different, you know, attention to lifestyles that punk represented, you know, she was a key player. And what you realise is just how small the scene was. We're probably only talking 100 people made the punk rock revolution. Yes, it obviously spun off into huge copycatism after it had already died in a way. I mean, it was dead by 1977. And if you think about how global punk came in terms of fashion, culture, music, obviously, you know, it was really, at least in the UK, I mean, American punk was different, but in the UK it was only about 100 people, you know, behind that. And you realise just how, from tiny acorns, these sort of global things, the same with hip-hop in the Bronx, you know, and how global that is now, but again, from the small seeds from which it developed. I mean, this is I was 13 in 1977, so I was aware of punk without ever being at the heart of it. You know, I wasn't going to gigs at 13, not till I was 14 and 15. And what, you know, but I know a lot about it, but what I found enlightening about this book was that it had strong antecedents in sort of queer culture, which, you know, post-Stonewall, post-legalisation of homosexuality in 1968 in the UK, finally, sort of there was sort of a completely independent queer culture of clubs and bars and cinemas, or at least films being made for a queer audience. And that this is the world that she and her confreres inhabited, and that very much, you know, contributed to punk. I mean, everyone knows that some of the antecedents of punk in London was the art schools. Adam Ant himself had attended art school, but also the pub rock circuit of certain pubs in London that got a reputation for having concerts, you know, small-scale concerts by bands like the Stranglers, Ian Dury and the Blockheads. But this third wing, which I wasn't really aware of, again, as I say, at age 13, was how it had grown out of queer culture and queer clubs. And that the change that punk made was that it was a movement out of clubs and into gigs. Punk was very much a gig environment. And of course it went back to clubs with the new romanticism of people like Boy George and Ultravox and Duran Duran, who's, even though they were bands who gigged, this, you know, a huge part of that movement was in clubs like the Blitz Club, of which she was also a part of. So, you know, that was an antecedent of punk that I wasn't aware of, just how important in terms of networking, and also obviously the clothes that sort of grew out of sort of queer fashion and transgressive fashion. That was, you know, crucial to punk. So I just thought this was really a fabulous, fabulous read. I will say that sort of she tired of punk, as of course a lot of people do, although whether she still regards herself as punk, I don't know. But it's interestingly that, you know, she did sort of have sort of small runs in bands, and that when the latest version of that broke up, she formed, or she was integral to, a rockabilly band, a genre of music that looked back to the 1950s, which I personally find really disappointing, because, you know, punk was looking to sweep away that sort of nostalgic looking back, drawing on one's musical roots from the past, and also that the Teds, who were sort of associated or linked sort of musically, were the dire enemies of punks, and who used to attack them on the streets because of how they looked, and they were sort of very representative of sort of the 1977 Queen Silver Jubilee. They, you know, were outraged that the Sex Pistols released a song called God Save the Queen attacking the Jubilee, and two of the Sex Pistols were actually stabbed just when sort of walking about on the street. But again, I think she makes the point very cogently that punk died sort of because it was commercially subsumed by all the major labels, but she also makes the point that it died because from the queer cultural roots, which was very welcoming to an anything goes notion of gender and identity, and do it, you know, whatever you want. So in a way, it's sort of hippie plus attitudes. It very soon became a sort of male, macho, violence at gigs, hostile to women, and, you know, homophobic. And that's when punk died, when it surrendered its much more diverse roots. So I just thought this was fabulous. 5 stars. And there you have it. That is my recent reads. I'm not sure what I'm going to read next. I also have a video to shoot on 2 non-fiction books about Franz Kafka. Apologies, that was due to be my next upload, but that will be after this recent reads. Anyway, till next time, thanks very much.